Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Leah Price. She's the author of What We Talk About When We Talk About Books, the History and Future of Reading. She's written and edited many books on books and is a professor at Rutgers, and she's also the founder of the Initiative for the Book. What a great initiative. I love that initiative. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Price.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. So more about books there too. Here's a feeling that goes back to my childhood and maybe all of our childhoods. Walking into a bookstore, big or small, smelling the glue, seeing all those neat, fresh covers lined up in categories. You walk around, pick a few up, and then you'd wish you could magically absorb the words and the content so that you could go to the next one. But of course, that's impossible. So you open it up, look at the title page, the dedication, the table of contents, and then there you are. The first word of a new book. The feeling of the paper made you feel smart. Just holding it made you feel smart. And if you were reading the right way, you realized you suddenly knew something, or at least felt like maybe you were even somewhere else. Ideally, this was not just time well spent, but the best way to spend time. My first question, Dr. Price, before we even get into the history of books, is even though books have universal recognition, maybe up there with water and music, everybody knows what a book is, right? What is a book? What's the definition of a book?
That is such a difficult question. I feel like a fraud. I'm a book historian, but you ask me to define a book, and I am stumped because people have proposed definitions ranging from word limits. A book is something containing enough words for it to have a spine wide enough to contain the title so that you can see what it is when you're walking in that bookstore. Or a book that is something, a book as opposed to a periodical, a magazine, a newspaper, is something that lasts longer than a month. Or a book is a printed object as opposed to a manuscript object. But of course, to each of these definitions, we can think of counterexamples. Is a notebook a book, even if its pages are blank? Is an audiobook a book, even though it takes the form of an MP3 file? And of course, is an ebook a book, even if it takes a different electronic file format? It might be more interesting to ask what is not a book. Your podcast is clearly not a book. I think we all know that intuitively.
But what if I said it was?
Well, and if you printed out a transcript of your podcast and bound it at the local copy shop, if you still have such a thing in your neighborhood, would that be a book?
I don't know. Probably not, but I don't know. And I guess if I took everything I ever wrote and said, these are the writings of Evan Axelbank, it would be a smattering of emails and news stories and introductions to podcasts and all these other things. And that really wouldn't be a book. But what if I said, this is a book of my writing?
So one of the unusual things historically about the way we think about books now is that we think of them in general as a very cheap medium. And that's because most of the books that we handle now are, as you said in your opening, they're glued together rather than sewn. They're made from wood pulp paper, which degrades very quickly, rather than from linen paper, which lasts. And so although when we think about books, we think of them by contradistinction to newspapers or tweets or blog posts or perhaps even podcasts, we think of them as a kind of monumental, classic, hand-me-down to be treasured. If you look in practice at the lifespan or the horizon of expectation of most of the books in the world today, in practice they're actually more like disposables. Most books are not going to be handed down through the generations, and that is one of the examples of a gap between the theory and the practice of how we think about the book. When it comes to books, I think most of us are hypocrites. You can see this around book disposal, where every time some unfortunate public librarian puts a bunch of books out in the dumpster behind the library, because libraries have limited shelf space and limited staff time to catalog and maintain books, if someone walks by that dumpster and posts a photo of the bin overflowing with books on social media, there are going to be howls of protest. But if you try to find people to actually give those deaccessioned books a good home, it's another story. We are sentimental about books, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the way we use them.
I have books because of the podcast and also from my years and years of collecting that I would like to give away to someone, and no one will take them. No one will take them. And so here I am holding on to the books because my library stopped accepting donations during COVID, and I can't bear the thought. I would consider it a crime to even throw them away. So here I am holding these books, and I won't say whose books they are. Probably nobody who's been on the show. But you develop this sentimental attachment until you are ready to get rid of them, and then it doesn't matter. I want to go back to what you said, though. You started to go into the history of the books of books a little bit, and I want to ask: is it too easy to use the Gutenberg printing press as sort of a starting point, as if those were the first books? So just kind of explain the history of how the book evolved to what we have today. And I'm holding up yours here. We have a book that is bound with glue and is printed very neatly with perfect type and is bound and sold by a company trying to make money. Can you trace the evolution of this? And then I guess use Gutenberg as the before and after.
That's a great question, because you have distinguished the physical form of the book, the fact that it's printed and glued and so forth, from the commercial form of the book, which is the fact that it is designed to make at least a little bit of money. And both of those are relatively new phenomena historically. But even after the technology of print becomes the dominant way of producing these objects called books in Europe and in the West, the idea of a book that we have today as something produced for purchase by an anonymous end user who does not know the author and produced on spec for buyers who are not known to the person or the corporation producing them. This is an understanding of the book that arises only much later than the actual technology of movable type, so that for much of the printed books history, books are produced by subscription, meaning that first you get some people to sign up to agree to buy it, and only then do you produce the book. And also, even after the arrival of movable type, a lot of books in Europe continued to be hand copied and circulated in manuscript right up through the 20th century and through the Cold War, when on both sides of the Iron Curtain, censorship was circumvented by producing small runs of books through the use of a typewriter and carbon paper, or hand copying, or various other kinds of small scale duplicating technologies. So increasingly, it seems too simple to think of a dichotomy between print and manuscript. There's instead something more like a spectrum running from the blockbuster bestseller at one end, which a book like mine absolutely is not, and then at the other end, the kinds of small scale circulation within a group of people personally known to each other, where the book morphs into something more like a letter. So it's a continuum rather than a binary distinction.
And I do want to say, even though you have said, though, maybe my book wasn't a blockbuster, we should all read this book, because our podcast is based on books. And it seems a little silly, I think, that all these years I've been reading these books and never really understood the true history of them. So thank you for writing your book about books. Let's play a game based on the introduction of your book. Let's guess what time period Dr. Price is citing here. The headline on the newspaper that you describe in your introduction is "The End of Books. Could print survive the age of video, of cell phones, of computers?" No, we're not talking about 2021. What year are we talking about, Dr. Price? When did that headline come out? The End of Books.
We are talking, if I remember correctly,
Yeah, right. You
something
forget.
over a decade ago.
Oh, it was, so I'll give you it was 1992. 1992. So we know that books survived that age. When was the first time people predicted books couldn't last? This is going to be the end of books. This is the last generation to read books.
That's a good punchline, because that headline, "The End of Books," has been recycled over and over again. Hemlines are up, hemlines are down, but the middle class is always rising and the book is always dying. And the only difference really is the successive villains that have been accused of being the competitor to or the murderer of the book, so that as far back as the late 19th century, futurologists and science fiction writers were predicting that various kinds of proto audiobook were going to kill the book, that people in the future were going to walk around with a kind of record player strapped to their back in a purpose-made backpack, and they were going to have some kind of big speaking trumpet stuck in their ear, and no one was going to read a book once they could listen to books. In the account of one of these enthusiasts for the talking book, you can find a picture of the housewife of the future doing the dishes while listening to one of these gigantic machines, with the takeaway that the problem of the higher education of women will be triumphantly resolved. Now, as a podcaster, I'm sure that it warms your heart to think of this long line of predictions of people listening rather than reading. But if you fast forward to the time that the article you're mentioning in the New York Times Magazine comes from the 1990s, that was the era of hyperbolic optimism about the possibilities of hypertext. I'm old enough to remember complete confidence that the book of the future was going to be full of hyperlinks and singing, dancing, animated, interactive enrichments to the dull, plain, colorless form that is the printed book. And you as a podcaster are well placed to appreciate that in a way what has happened is exactly the opposite. The only form of electronic book that has taken off more dramatically than was predicted is not the kind of electronic book that people think of when they talk about ebooks. It's not devices like the Amazon Kindle, it's the audiobook. And when you think about it, an audiobook is the opposite of hypertext. It's the opposite of those interactive books or vlooks or video and book mashup that people in the 1990s were confidently predicting, because you can't browse an audiobook. You can't, it's actually extremely difficult to interact with an audiobook. It's harder to go backwards in an audiobook than it is in a printed book. It's harder to skip in an audiobook than it is in a printed book. In a way, it's a very passive, constrained, captive experience. And the big surprise for me as a book historian in watching the rise of the audiobook is to see that sometimes less is more. People don't want to control the books that they're reading. They want to lie back and be controlled by the book. And that is what this extremely linear, pared down form of the audiobook, or indeed the podcast, does so elegantly.
I love one of the lines in your book, which is, if the book is dying, the funeral is an open casket for it. The 1990s are a critical time, you argue, in the life of books, when almost all the information in the world was suddenly available in a way that seemed to threaten the need for books. There was this idea that I just need to read. If I need to learn something, I can read it in a book and then I'll know. The 1990s are when people, as you put it, of your generation, began feeling guilty about letting chores crowd out their relationships with one another. And you say, in the 1990s, what we lusted for wasn't a person. Our fantasy was to reconnect with books, as all this information, this digital information, was suddenly streaming into our rooms every day, our living rooms with a computer. What did you mean by that?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
The book has become, I think, over the course of the past few decades, something defined negatively as the opposite of whatever we don't like about modern life. The book is a not laptop. The book then becomes a not smartphone. The book becomes not social media. It represents, or it comes to symbolize, a different rhythm of life, a kind of quiet contemplation as opposed to the frenzied pace of the disposable culture that we experience in the rest of our media environment. And I'm extremely sympathetic to this understanding of the book. I too want to keep the book as a retreat or a kind of bolt hole from which we can hide from overstimulation. And at the same time, I think it's an extremely reductive and possibly false representation of what the book is, because historically, books have been, throughout their existence, one of the most rapidly changing technologies. Books were the first good to be available for browsing on open access shelves in stores. Books were the first commodity on which inventory control systems were tried out. Books have been the guinea pig for various kinds of marketing and warehousing and distribution systems, which is in fact one reason why when a certain entrepreneur decided to try out this crazy new thing called e-commerce, Jeff Bezos
Yeah,
decided
how'd
to
that go
take...
for him, huh?
Well, exactly. He decided to take books as his proof of
Right.
concept or his guinea pig, not only because they're not perishable, they are the same shape as a mailing envelope, and there are a lot of unique instances of them, but also because books were at that point one of the best inventoried commodities, so that even before we had ebooks, we had digital keeping track of analog commodities. And in that sense, books have always been early adopters of new commercial technologies, and that's why I always feel a little bit ambivalent when I walk into a public library that offers a technology-free reading room where you have to turn off your phone and put away your laptop, and you can curl up in a delightful beanbag to read a paperback. I love curling up in a beanbag and reading a paperback as much as the next person, but it seems to me like false advertising to call that sort of space technology free, because the book is the mother of all technologies in terms of how
And the
it's
beanbag is
manufactured, in terms of
technology.
how it's sold. We don't notice that it's a technology because it's such an elegantly transparent and familiar technology. And so part of what I'm trying to do in this book is to ask readers to become more self-conscious about what we do when we open a book, not to look through the book as if it were made out of glass, but to look at the book.
It strikes me as you're talking that even though the book is changing, as you put it, the technology is changing. Once the book is printed, it can't change. The book is the book. I guess with ebooks, they can send updates to them, but with a printed book, what you're holding is this final piece, and you're now sort of part of absorbing this final piece. And that leads me, I think, to the point that you're making, is that for some reason, books became equal to virtue, that this ability to turn everything else off at least from an outside perspective, you turned everything else off and now you're sitting there holding a book. As you put it, it's not cell phone, it's not laptop, it's not TV, it's not music. People, for instance, come into my house and they see my bookshelves and they go, wow, look at you. You argue book became equal to virtue.
Yes, the book as the equivalent of something like noise-canceling earphones that shut out all this static around us. That said, I would want to take issue with your description of the book as a finished product. It may seem that way, but think about people writing in books. If you have the depressing experience of walking into a college bookstore and looking at the books that you assigned for your course,
The
you will see,
marginalia.
well, exactly, or the absence of marginalia. I know that for me it's depressing to see pristine, crisp books that sell for a high price that were assigned for my course the previous semester, because that suggests that students have not interacted with them.
So
If you look at,
you want to see the marginalia in your book.
I want to see the book dirty. I want to see the pages creased and limp. And when you see the scribbled up printed page, you realize that print is only the first stage of what goes into making a book. This is something that I think you can see even better with cookbooks than with textbooks. If you walk not into the room where you have your lovely pristine bookshelves, but if you walk into the kitchen and look at the books lying spread-eagled on the counter of a passionate cook, you're going to be able to tell a lot about that person through the physical form of the book. I know that I find my way to the recipes that actually worked for me by feeling which pages of the cookbook are stuck together, because those are the pages that have been gummed up with batter, and the pages that are nice and crisp, those are going to be the recipes that I made once, and then I've never opened the book to that page again because the souffle didn't rise. Now, the understanding of a book as a finished product or as the raw material for later personalization is something that changes a lot depending on what the genre of the book is, and also depending on different moments of history. For the first few centuries of the printed book's existence, the default was for books to be produced without a cover, so that you could buy the printed sheets and you could personalize them by bringing them to the binder and having them bound to your specifications. So think of this as being like the way you choose your own skin for your smartphone or your laptop. And also, for most of the early history of printing, books didn't necessarily have a table of contents or an index or all these other navigational aids that we now take for granted. You, the user, would make your own index. You would write it down in the end papers, and so you could customize your index to make the entries that you yourself were interested in. The same way that, again, with a cookbook, you might make notes in the front or back flyleaf of which of the recipes turned out particularly well.
Talk to me about bookshelves. We're hinting, we're going around the edges here of how we display our books. Let's get into the actual displays themselves. One of the lines you have in your book is, as our shelves emptied, we feared losing ourselves. Why is a bookshelf itself important and autobiographical for the book collector?
It's a visual aid. It's a mnemonic aid. When you walk along the bookshelf, You are reminded of the content of the books in it, and it's also a sorting device. The way people group their books is extremely variable, extremely personal, extremely revealing.
Do
Social
you,
historians can tell a lot by looking at which room of the house a book
uh,
was kept in.
do you want to hear
And
how I do mine?
I do.
Okay, let's do it. My books are organized in order of presidential administration from Washington to Biden. Then after that, they are organized by time period. So you're going to go from basically the American Revolution to, to the present day, number of contemporary topics. Um, the key, though, is that I do them by size. So the presidential books are all in hardcover, and then you have the hardcover books by time period, and then you have softcover books by time period. I don't like the jagged look of different sized books, even if they're in the same genre or in the same presidential administration, let's say. I guess I could ask, what does that tell you about me? But what does that tell you about the larger story of how we want to display our books and why there's a certain sense of peace when we want to look at our own bookshelves?
That's the way you put your books on the bookshelves. Can I ask how you find your books on the bookshelves? Can you always find what you're looking for?
I can always find what I'm looking for. Now, my collection's not giant. It's about 300 books or so. But if I'm certainly looking in order of presidential administration and then in order of time period. So in general, I'm pretty good at going right to where I want to go to. And I look at them just about every day. Isn't that funny, though? We gaze at them. Even though we've read them, we gaze at them. I gaze. I want to look at them. I like seeing. When I sit and read in my office, I like to look and see all the other books I've read behind the one book that I'm reading right now off in the distance.
You're right that we make a huge cultural decision through the sheer fact of deciding that books should be on open shelves, whereas, say, clothing in a well-run house
Definitely.
is not
Right.
visible. Now, that may have something to do with how much time you want to spend folding your clothes, but I think it also has to do with, as you say, the sense of the duality of a book as both an object for use and as an object for display. And this is something that has become especially obvious during this miserable era of the Zoom backdrop, where probably many of your listeners have looked at the social media account called Room Raider, where speakers are rated on the organization of the bookshelves in back of them, and where one Washington, D.C. area bookstore has started to sell hollowed out books by the yard, so that if your IKEA Billy bookcase particle board can't stand up to the weight of the serious tomes that you want to have behind you to give you an air of intellectual gravitas, you can get them in a lighter format.
Oh, I'm shaking my head. Hollowed out books reminds me of The Great Gatsby, right? With the books that had never been opened. Um, I want to ask. I wanted to go through some of your chapters, but this conversation is flying by. I don't know that I've ever had a conversation go this quickly. My goodness, your time flies when you're having fun. Let's go to chapter 3. It says, "Our books, what we read and when we read them, define our lives. From bedtime stories to morning newspapers. What is it about a type of book that actually defines our mood and begins to influence the very circadian rhythm of life?"
That's an interesting question because surprisingly, the bedtime story is a relatively recent invention. Until a few centuries ago, the bedtime story was not part of children's routines, partly because until you get lighting that is not going to set the bedding on fire, it's hard to read in bed. So the idea that we now have of books as infinitely portable objects that you can slip in your pocket and read on the train or snuggle up with in bed is not actually inherently part of what a book was from the beginning. Early books are more like early computers, this big kind of mainframe sized object that lives on a piece of furniture the way we still, some of us have a dictionary on a lectern that doesn't go anywhere. And not until you get kinds of lighting that are portable do you get books that are portable. And that's when you start to get the idea of the book as a kind of sleeping pill that is going to, let's hope, stun your kids into submission at night, rather than, say, the book as something that children read aloud to old people, either because literacy is increasing in every generation, and so children are likelier to be literate than their parents and grandparents, or because glasses, spectacles are expensive, and lighting is dim, and so children's stronger eyes can see the book and they can read aloud to their elders. I love to read aloud with my kid, and so for me, this is a huge part, not just of my kids' circadian rhythms, but of my circadian rhythms. And yet, the newspaper, the morning newspaper, was until very recently a hugely crucial part of waking up, equivalent to the morning cup of coffee. I'm not sure that we have that sense of the morning newspaper as symmetrical with the bedtime story anymore. So as we move toward media that are accessible anytime, any place, I think we're losing some of that sense of temporal definition or rhythm.
How much has the ability to move our words around effortlessly on the page? In other words, I assume most people write now with computers. My favorite, Robert Caro, writes with a pen and paper first and then goes to his typewriter. But how much has that ability to take a word and move it, or take a paragraph and move it to an entirely different chapter, a different section, how does that change the book themselves? And does that make the books better, or does it make them too polished?
I sometimes ask my students to write the first sentence of their dissertation on a typewriter that I keep in my office for this purpose. And I ask them to do that because when you sit down to type, you have to think about what you're going to write before you write it. And that can be intimidating, but I think it can also really...
Why would you want to think before you write?
Well, indeed. The closest equivalent to that is probably the podcast that we're doing right now. One of the things that I find really difficult about this kind of conversation as opposed to writing is that you can't just launch confidently into a sentence and then decide halfway through that you should have started it another way and go back and delete. There's a kind of finality to speech that is not the case with writing. So I do think that word processing lends itself to word soup in a way that is not the case if you're sitting down to a typewriter, or even more, the other exercise that I ask my students, graduate and undergraduate, to do as part of the Rutgers Book Initiative is to set a page of their own thoughts in type, to actually typeset a page, and then we all print it. And it is so labor intensive to pick up these fiddly little bits of type and make sure that you're not putting them upside down or dropping them on the floor. It is such a physically and cognitively demanding process to set type that I think there's a kind of seriousness about the result that students end up feeling that is very hard for any of us to feel when we're just blithely keyboarding a stream of consciousness that we're going to go back and reshuffle later.
Is a book the best way to learn? Let me give a couple of counterpoints. Wouldn't it be better, as opposed to reading a book about the Andes Mountains? Shouldn't I just go there? Or if I want to read, if I want to learn about, let's say World War II, couldn't I just read a documentary? If I want to learn about climate change, couldn't I couldn't I find a podcast? If I want to learn about, math, I could find a lecture. So where does book rank in the methods we have discovered at this point to learn?
It depends on what you're learning and why you're learning it, what you're learning it for, and to some extent on who you are. We know that people learn in very different ways. Neurodiversity leads to different media working differently for different people. One thing that the past 2 years of remote teaching have taught educators at all levels is that you can do some kinds of mental operations, you can have some kinds of intellectual experiences online that you cannot in person, but conversely, there are things that you can do in person, interpersonally, intellectually, cognitively, that you can absolutely not do remotely. I have been surprised and pleased by the fact that some of my shyer students who didn't speak in class, when we had class remotely, they went crazy in the chat window of Zoom and wrote long threads that were up there with the kinds of letters that Enlightenment men of science used to exchange with one another. Each of these media makes different kinds of thinking possible. That doesn't mean that they're interchangeable. On the contrary, I think it means that we need to use all of these different forms in concert with one another to figure out the best division of labor among them.
I'm embarrassed to say this, especially to an English professor, but I have not read a book of fiction in about 20 years or so. I mean, early years in college, sure, but it's been a long time. what is more productive for the reader? What do you learn more from, fiction or nonfiction?
Depends on
The
what you're
division of labor
trying
you were talking
to
about.
do.
Let's go through a couple of quickies here. I feel sort of ridiculous asking this of you because you've probably read 5,000 books. What's your favorite book?
I'm going to pass.
Oh, come on. Can you give
That's
3?
like asking who your favorite child is. I take the 5th.
Okay. Um, uh, when you look at bookshelves, what do you look for, whether it's in a someone's home or, let's say, in a library? What do you find your eye moving towards?
I look for the books that are different. The book that's lying on its side when all the others are vertical, or the book that is misshelved, the book out of place. That's usually the book that's getting the most use.
I have a spreadsheet that I keep all of the books I've read on: number of pages, title, of course, author, the dates I started and finished them. What does that tell you about the place that books either hold for me or books hold in society?
That suggests to me that you experience reading a book as an accomplishment rather than, or as well as an experience. Is that a fair deduction, or I'm mischaracterizing you?
I would say it's both. I would say it's an experience. It goes to my love of baseball and sports where things are recorded and written down. And I sort of want to know, I like to keep track of, yes, the accomplishment, but also if I have the dates, I can see when I read a certain book and what was going on in my life as I was reading it.
So that's interesting that you see your reading life and your living life as two parallel tracks, or as it were, two subplots.
One of the quotes in your book that's just wonderful is, "Show me how you want to read, and I'll show you who you want to be." Expand on that for us.
I think that at this moment in history, when we think of ourselves as readers, we're thinking of our best self. We're thinking of the version of ourselves, or the part of ourselves that is the most reflective and curious and attentive. And I'm sure that this is not true for all readers, but I do think that there's a way in which, for many of us, when we open a book, we are already making a commitment to a certain kind of deep, patient, experimental, exploratory, intellectual, and emotional openness.
Lastly, just reassure us, give us, I mean, the statistics look pretty good for books right now, but books will survive, yes?
They've certainly done well in this pandemic, and at a moment where white collar workers are fed up with the flatness of Zoom rectangles, I think it is more appealing than ever to return to the book as a three-dimensional object, not a flat page, but a fold, a triangle into which we can nest and lose ourselves.
So yes. Yes.
So yes, And also the podcast.
Yes, that's what we want, right? Dr. Leah Price, the author of What We Talk About When We Talk About Books, The History and Future of Reading. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Certainly check out that book and her website, which is leahprice.org. She's on Twitter at Leah@whatprice. Love that Twitter handle. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History, and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.